Okay, hi everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Claire Nicholas. I'm the Assistant Curator of Ethnology at the Sam Noble Museum. You are here for Art in the Service of Science, One Illustrator's Story. This is a talk and conversation with renowned scientific illustrator Nancy Halliday. Before we introduce Nancy and get started on her talk, I wanted to do a bit of housekeeping, and also we'll hear from Haley Prestafilippo, who will talk a little bit about the SOVA program. But first of all, we are recording the webinar, and we will figure out how we will share that after the fact, and let all of you know who have registered if you want to check it out after today. Also, we do have closed captioning enabled in case you would like to make use of that. You just kind of go down to the bottom bar of the Zoom kind of window, and it gives you a choice to enable closed captioning. We're going to basically hear from Nancy for about an hour, and then you can certainly post questions or comments in both the Q&A and the chat function of Zoom as we go, but we will go ahead and hold the responses to those questions until the end of the session. So we're here from 2 to 3:30, so probably the last 30 minutes we'll have to have a more kind of back and forth dialogue with Nancy. So I just wanted to thank the sponsors for this talk, and of course thank Nancy for joining us. So the talk is held sort of in conjunction with a exhibit currently on view at the Sam Noble Museum, which is Flightlines, The Art of Natural History at OU. It is all about scientific illustration. It features a lot of student work, students from the School of Visual Arts. Haley's going to talk about that in a second. And also some work from the ethnology collection at the museum. We have a naturalist art collection, and so works are drawn from that for the exhibit as well. Also for this talk in particular, so the exhibit is kind of co-sponsored by the Sam Noble Museum and the School of Visual Arts. And this talk in particular, we want to thank the School of Visual Arts for funding and supporting this talk. So Haley, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you say a few words.
Thank you all for being here. We are so excited to have Nancy with us and to hear about her work and her journey as a scientific illustrator. Claire connected Nancy and I a few years ago, and through a small, brief email exchange, Nancy offered her support for our growing program. She gave me advice and especially suggested the Guild of Natural Science Illustrators, the GNSI, which is an amazing resource that we've used a lot. Since that email, our program has continued to grow with much thanks to the tremendous support from the Sam Noble. We're sitting here in the museum today with a full class, ready to learn. If you're able to visit the Flightline show, you'll see work from students coming from a wide variety of majors and backgrounds, which is one of the coolest things about this program. We have bio majors, marketing, engineering, as well as multidisciplinary involvement within our own School of Fine Arts. We have our studio art, design, art, tech, and culture programs. Students from each area are represented. So it's been a really amazing journey moving through this program. And Nancy might not realize it, but she's been a really integral part of this class over the year through her written word and her imagery found in the Guild Handbook of Scientific Illustration's Bird chapter, which has been a frequent resource used by the students over the year. So I'm just really overjoyed to have her here with us today. Thank you.
Thanks, Haley. Okay, so without further ado, I want to introduce Nancy. Let me attempt to advance the slides. This is the poster for the exhibit. So the title of the talk is Art in the Service of Science, One Illustrator's Story. And we are really honored to welcome Nancy Halliday, who's a distinguished scientific illustrator. She's here to share a little bit about her trajectory, her kind of multitude of experiences accumulated over 50 years of professional work. Nancy is a founding member and historian of the Guild of Natural Science Illustrators. Her career has taken her all over the United States, including positions at the Smithsonian as exhibits artist and the Florida State Museum as scientific illustrator. Nancy also collaborated with a colleague to develop one of the first collegiate programs in scientific illustration at the University of Florida. And I also want to point out that Nancy is a graduate of OU, where she had the fortune to take classes with our own Dr. George Meeks Sutton. Today, Nancy is based in the Chicago area and works as a freelance artist and teacher. So before I turn things over to Nancy, I just want to remind everyone that all of the work that's featured in the presentation is copyrighted, and we would just ask that you not take photos or screenshots or otherwise reproduce the work that we're showing. So I think that's everything for me. And Nancy, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you very much, Claire. And first of all, I want to thank the university for this opportunity to do this, University of Oklahoma and the School of Visual Arts very much for arranging for this, and especially to Claire for I've been working with her so much to get this talk underway. As Claire mentioned, I want to talk about an hour of where I've been and what I've done, and then I want to leave enough time for questions from all of you. I was born in the middle of the Depression. My father was a salesman and a very good one, but he worked for various organizations, which meant that we moved a lot, a great deal. We moved mostly around the Great Lakes area. So because I went to so many great schools, I really didn't have the opportunity to make many friends. So nature became my friend. And in those days, there was a great deal of nature opportunities because there were only 3 billion people in the entire world at that time. And there were a great deal of open spaces and forests that I could explore, which I did as a child. I expressed such an interest in birds at an early age that my father got for me the big book, that old book, Birds of America, edited by T. Gilbert Pearson, which I still have. I paged through it so many times that the pages are all worn out. I even left it out in the rain one time, and the cover is all wrinkled. But I still have this poor old beat up book. But all the color plates were done by Louis Agassiz Fuertes, and I became very well acquainted with his work through that book. My mother was a fashion illustrator and a very good one. She always found jobs working, doing fashion illustrations for every major department store wherever we lived. And of course, there were art materials laying around the house. And I showed an art talent very early on. So my parents encouraged me to continue to draw. My father sent me to college at Michigan State University in 1954. He didn't ask me, he just said, "You're going to Michigan State." So I found myself in East Lansing. I majored in home economics because that's what girls were expected to do in that time. I thought I'd just get married and have kids like everybody else. But I was not suited for domestication whatsoever. I failed my cooking class and I failed my sewing class. And I was wondering, what am I going to do now? But in the meantime, have always been a museum buff. And there was a very tiny museum at Michigan State. It was a couple of rooms that were kind of stashed underneath the stadium, I believe, and a couple of exhibits there. And I remember when I was a child, we lived here in Chicago till I was about 9. My mother always took me down to the Field Museum, and I would go right to the African Hall, with the wonderful dioramas and the taxidermy by Carl Akeley. I couldn't get enough of that. So when I found the museum at Michigan State, I went there quite a bit and got to know the people who work there, the director. And there I discovered that I could major in zoology. It never occurred to me that I could major in what I was interested in. Uh, so I switched my major to zoology, but I only had one year left and came back home to Detroit. At that time, we were living in a suburb of Detroit. And my aunt, my father's sister, gave me enough money to go to school, art school for a year. This was the Society Art School, the School of Society of Arts and Crafts, which is now the Center for Creative Studies. And it is now a major a source for industrial people who do design work, particularly in the automobile industry. So it's a big school now, but it was a very small one then. I majored in commercial art because I didn't know what else to major in. I knew I wasn't going to be a painter. I certainly didn't have any talent in ceramics, but I had no intention of being an advertising artist. I didn't want have my artwork used to persuade people to buy things they didn't need. So so I finished that, and then I thought, what now? But in the meantime, the museum back at Michigan State University, I got a big bonus in that they took over the old library building. The museum, the university was in desperate need of a larger library, and one was finally being built, a really good big one. And the library, the building was that was used as a library, was sort of an old castle-like building on top of a knoll, and the museum was to have that. So of course they were expanding their staff, and because of my experience of being there with them, with the museum folks, I was invited to join the staff, so I did. And of course, in the beginning, it was moving in and tearing walls down. I was Girl Friday. I was hanging wallpaper, painting walls. I was a carpenter's assistant. I was doing all that kind of heavy hard work, and I loved it every minute of it. And then when the museum finally opened, my job was as receptionist, which meant that I spoke to visiting school groups that came in. And because I was working with John Hope, an elder man who was on our staff, I lectured about the dioramas. John had studied under Carl Akeley and really knew how to do taxidermy properly. He also was a background painter, and the museum had changed the old reading room into a hall of dioramas, full size dioramas. The white-tailed deer. I think we had a moose, and I don't know what the mountain lion. I can't remember what they all were, but full size dioramas. And John did all the taxidermy, and he did that background paintings. So, and I was of course fascinated with all of that. So when the school kids came in, I lectured to them how animals were mounted, how dioramas were painted, and the kids loved it. And I was very happy doing that. But I soon began to realize that unless I was going to be a receptionist the rest of my life, I needed to go back to school. I really needed to get my degree. And now I knew what it was going to be in zoology. So I tried to go to night school, but all the lab courses were offered in the daytime. So I was stymied there. And I asked my father, Dad, you've given the other kids 4 years in school. Can you give me another 2? He said, all right, I'll do it. So I quit my job at the museum and went back to school full time at Michigan State. But I immediately ran into problems with mathematics because zoology there requires a pretty heavy math, several math courses and chemistry and physics and all of that. I couldn't do the couldn't pass chemistry because I couldn't do the algebra for the experiments. So it's very frustrating. I didn't know what the heck I was going to do. In the meantime, a number of people at Michigan State had gone down to the University of Oklahoma, including quite a few people from the Michigan State Museum staff. And they had invited me to come down there because the math requirements weren't quite so hard. I remember particularly Bob Burns, who was a graduate student at Michigan State, and he went down to OU to teach mammalogy. Come on down here, he said. So I did. I came down to OU, and by then, of course, I was very well acquainted with George Sutton's work, and I was just delighted to take classes. I took several classes with Dr. Sutton. And I was, of course, older than all the other students by that time. So I hung around with Doc's guys, gang. There were about 5 or 6 of them. I was the only girl. And I remember particularly John O'Neill, because John was a beginning artist, and he was very interested in birds of South America. And he had gotten a grant from McElhenney. And every time I have songs from McElhenney, I think about John. He had gotten a grant from McElhenney through LSU, Louisiana State University, to travel to Peru every summer and collect birds down there. And John had ended up discovering more species of birds than anyone living at that time. And being an artist, he not only wrote about them, but he illustrated them too. So it was just fun working with John. Doc Sutton, never had a student, but he was always willing to critique our drawings and paintings. So John and I would bring our paintings to him, and he would always give us advice. He, of course, was a student of Fuertes, as you probably know. Let's see. I'm going to be reading from my script that I wrote out to make sure I stay online here. So I got my Bachelor of Science from the OU in 1962, and one summer I attended your school, the biological station at Lake Texoma, and Dr. Carpenter asked me to do some illustrations for him there. Go ahead, Claire, start with the first slide. And these were Carpenter was studying the behavior of mice, Paramiscus mice in particular. And so I did these for him, and that's essentially how I began in scientific illustration, just doing illustrations for professors who were doing research and needing an illustration for their papers in their journals. At the time, the term scientific illustration didn't exist. I was just doing illustrations. So I stayed at OU for a while after graduation, freelancing. I did a series of conodont and graptolite drawings for Dr. Reggie Harris, several hundred actually, paleontological illustrations for Dr. Carl Bransom, Oklahoma Geological Survey, skulls for Dr. Burns, kangaroo rats for him too, microscope drawings for Dr. Bulk, and sleeves for Dr. Clough Hopla, junipers and cacti for Dr. Marion Hall, flint tools for Dr. Robert Bell, lizards for Dr. Carpenter, same Carpenter, bryozoans for Dr. M.K. Elias, and et cetera, all for scientific journals. But of course, I was looking for a full-time job. I really needed and wanted to get a full-time job. But I found an advertisement for a summer job instead at the Museum of Northern Arizona. Now, being a flatlander and being romantic by heart, I have always been fascinated with the West, mountains of the West. So I couldn't resist. I applied for that summer assistantship, and I got it. So I put my bike on the train, and I hopped in with it and I ended up in Flagstaff, where I spent a very, very wonderful summer. My job was really to help out with the Native American festival that they had every year. But we had plenty of free time there because we lived on the grounds, right under those beautiful San Francisco peaks. So I painted the peaks, climbed the peaks, and I caught a little chipmunk while I was there. Go ahead, Claire, with it. Yeah, this little guy was the most scrawny, miserable little thing, but I kept him in an aquarium and fattened him up on peanut butter. So by the time he was released, he was the fattest, glossiest chipmunk. I imagine him probably beating up all the other chipmunks in the block. But I did this painting of him, and he was a very patient model. Let's see, where were we here? In the meantime, I had put my name on the federal register list for illustrators, and through that, I received an offer for a position illustrating Pacific atoll plants for a bird distribution study sponsored by the Smithsonian in DC. So I moved to DC there in 1964. And when the plant illustrations were completed, I was asked by Dr. Mason Hale, the curator in the Division of Cryptogams, to help illustrate his forthcoming book, How to Know the Lichens. I say help because I was one of several illustrators. I did mostly the fructicose lichens. You probably know them as British soldiers. I did 71 altogether, pen and ink drawings. His book was published in 1969. It was one of the wire-bound How to Know series published by William C. Brown Company. As I was finishing that, one of the artists in the office of exhibits downstairs in the Museum of Natural History had died suddenly, and my name was still on the register. So it came up next and offered it to me, and boy, I'm glad to take it. Yes, indeed. So I was one of 4 artists on the staff. We were housed on the same floor with the 5 designers. We worked directly with them and with the curators as needed. Below us were the silkscreen, photography, and model making shops. We were a mixed age, mixed race, mixed gender group of multi-talented individuals, but boy, could we work together when getting a new hall opened or a temporary exhibit on a deadline. I joined just as the new African Hall was in its final planning stages, and I did many drawings of African tribespeople. There's one wearing clothing that was being exhibited in the cases, or other drawings show how the various musical instruments on display were played. I did these on coquille board, and they were all for silk screening. And then they were silk screened along with the type onto boards on which these items were displayed. I did, I think there were 6 drawings in coquille board for the Maasai case. And I have copies of all of them, but rather than show them individually, it's much better to show them in the case. You can't see all of them, but it was a series of drawings of a man going through all of his life stages, from herds boy to junior warrior to major warrior to big warrior in the middle, that he wearing that wonderful ostrich headdress there, and then finally to a married man with all of his responsibilities to his wife and children, then to an elder, and then finally to an aged man, all put into this case, all silk screen. The model shop made the cows, the cattle, and I painted all of those. That was fun. I enjoyed doing that. I did a whole series of course, I was there 4 years, so I did a whole series of artwork for them. I did some oil paintings, a salmon for the fish hall, a reconstruction of Archaeopteryx, a series of illustrations of Rancho La Brea for the Pleistocene Hall, and many, many more things. Now, the traditional role of the museum is to act as a storehouse and display venue for treasured objects found nowhere else. It should be a place for quiet contemplation and education. But about 1970 or so, museums began to sense competition with TV and other entertainment venues. The traditional passive displays were no longer considered relevant in a so-called modern world. Museums were trying to attract more visitors, and so therefore they began to install noisy, flashy audiovisual and so-called hands-on displays, many of which in those early days didn't work or broke down quickly. Museums, especially major ones, began to contract exhibits out to commercial design studios who were very eager for the opportunity. And in-house, hands-on exhibit crews were dismantled. We got a new director, and he did just that. One by one, we lost our jobs, all of our jobs. So I hung around for a while, doing mostly freelance work. Then one of the other illustrators, who also lost his job there, found a position as exhibits designer at Florida State Museum in Gainesville at the University of Florida, and invited me to join him on his staff, which I did in 1972. But before I go to Florida, I certainly want to talk about something very special happening back at the National Museum of Natural History. Now, that's a big building with a lot of different divisions and a lot of different curators and a lot of different illustrators, all stashed away in these various corners of the building. Now, we illustrators found out about one another, and we call one another and say, "Hey, what kind of eraser would you suggest for this kind of paper, or what kind of pinpoint?" Uh, one woman actually figured out a way to sharpen her pen points herself, and so we're confabbing back and forth on the phone. But Carolyn Gass, who was the illustrator in the vertebrates department, called us together for a lunch so we could discuss and share these techniques and ideas that we were batting about with one another. These weekly lunches developed into a group that Carolyn named the Guild of Natural Science Illustrators because of Carolyn's fondness for medieval guilds. Now, once it was formed, Carolyn wanted nothing to do with the leadership. So Elaine Hodges in the insect division stepped up. Elaine became essentially the mother of the guild. As we grew in size and eventually internationally, Elaine took it upon herself to edit a collection of articles about techniques and illustration methods into the book, which you know, the Guild Handbook of Scientific Illustration. She lived long enough to see it through a second edition before dying of breast cancer in 2006. And as mentioned, I did the bird illustration chapter. And you've got a copy. I hope it's a second edition that you've got, because that's been much improved. Sutton looked it over and he said, "Your first edition," said, "it's a lot about birds, but you didn't talk much about how to draw them." So in the second edition, I made an effort to try to explain more how to actually draw a bird rather than just what a bird is. Let's see. See, if I don't follow my text, I lose my track. And of course, you've already got that book, so good for you. And if you haven't joined the Guild, please do. We meet annually, usually in colleges during the summer when there's more room available, and of course it's cheaper. We stay in the dorms and we use the college lecture halls for our meetings. And of course, during COVID, we were doing entirely meetings by Zoom. But next year, we're finally going to meet in person. After 4 years, we're going to meet in person in Bridgewater, Connecticut. I hope you will join us. Now, Florida. Okay. At the Florida State Museum, I initially joined the exhibit's crew as an artist for a short while. But when Peg Esty left her job downstairs as a scientific illustrator, I applied for it and got it because with my science background, I felt I was more suited to that. So I worked for a variety of curators, doing illustrations of snails. You can put that on, Claire. That was for Fred Thompson, our snail curator. He had been poking around in the Caribbean and had done discovered a number of new species of snails, marine snails, mostly very, very, very small, microscopically small. And the trouble back in those days was that no camera could really photograph them because of their size. because the more you enlarge something, the less depth of field you have. So because these were so extremely tiny, you could only get the top, or you could only get the outline, or you might maybe get part of the edge. You couldn't get the whole thing in focus at once. In those days, of course, today you could do that, but in those, it was not possible to do that. So this is why I was asked to illustrate them. I did quite a few illustrations of these for Fred, Dr. Thompson, in wash. This is watercolor wash. And some of them, four views of this one. I also did a number of others that were much more ornamentated than this one. Um, um, let's see what. Let me see what else. Hang on a minute here. And then let's go on to the fish, Claire. I also did some again wash illustrations for Dr. Carter Gilbert, our fish archaeologist. Again, very small, very small animals, as you see from the scale. Now, when you put a fish into alcohol to preserve it, it curls up. Now, the way to uncurl it for an illustrator to see, to lay it out, to be able to draw it, one puts the thing into a pan, a metal pan with a wax bottom, and pours some of that alcohol in there, puts the fish in, and pins it out with very fine museum pins. Not the pins you use in sewing. No, very fine museum pins. But these fish were so tiny that a pin would destroy the fins. And so the only way I had to do this was to measure each ray and each spine, and then measure the distance between each ray and each spine, and the distance from the head to that first one, and then put the whole thing together in pieces, and essentially like a picture puzzle, because a pin would have destroyed it. So I did a number of these illustrations, uh, Dr. Gilbert. And here's one in pen and ink also, that I did too with scales, and that was printed in I didn't, so one of the scientific journals. Let's see. The next, and then I did a lot of illustrations of bones as well, for our paleontologist, Dr. Webb, Dr. David Webb, and Dr. Bruce McFadden. Now here we have the opposite problem with these snails. They were so tiny. I forgot to mention that I had a wonderful WILD, WILD microscope in my office with a camera lucida drawing. That's how I did these tiny snails. But here we have the opposite. This is a megalonyx skull down below. That's a ground sloth. They're big. They're really big. And to illustrate something like that, anything, in matter of fact, you need to get one point of view to avoid perspective distortions. You need to almost close your eye and draw from one point of view. Well, this thing was so big, I couldn't see it from one point without turning my head this way or turning my head that way. And of course, there's not any one point of view anymore. So how do you manage something that's that large? Well, instead of using a microscope, I used a telescope. I mounted this thing on something to hold it so it wouldn't fall over. And in front of it, I put a grid on a plastic plastic sheet that I could see through. And on my drawing sheet, I had also the same grid. And I looked at it through a telescope, and then I could draw it grid by grid through the grid and get it that way. It was the only way to avoid perspective distortions. And then Dr. Webb also had a monstrous calipers for these big bones in his office, a sliding wood calipers so I could double check all the drawings with the calipers. So between the telescope and the grid and the calipers, I was able to draw these bones. Now I want to say something about the technique. When I was first asked to draw bones, I really didn't quite know what to do. I knew stipple drawing pretty well, but I didn't quite know. Somehow these things didn't seem to lend themselves to stipple drawings. But then Dave Webb showed me some illustrations that had been done years ago in parallel line. And I was just entranced with those. They were so beautiful. It didn't take long for me to pick up that technique. And so I did many of my bones in parallel line, strictly parallel line. There's no cross hatching there at all. Sometimes when the bone was still encased in its matrix, which would be rock, then I could stipple the rock if they wanted to include the rock. So to show the difference between the textures of the two. Let's see. And let's see. So the next slide is, yes, I'm talking about all these things that I illustrated, but to tell you the truth, most of the work I did, about probably 75%, maybe even more than that, graphs, maps, and charts. Lots and lots and lots of graphs and maps. Mostly graphs. And they were done in the old-fashioned way with technical pens, the Kohinoor technical pens, stick-on dots, stick-on zipatone patterns, and stick-on letters to stick them one at a time. Yeah, it does a big job. This is something that Steve Humphrey had needed for bat, his work on bats. So lots and lots of graphs. As I say, most of my work was bats. But our curator of ornithology, Dr. Bill Hardy, who was also the head of the department at the time, asked me to do an illustration of Yucatan jays. He had been studying the behavior of these jays in Mexico. And so I was asked to do essentially showing the behavior different pelages see, I'm on mammals, sorry, plumage, the different plumages of these birds as they matured, because these birds like other jays do also have the you know they the offspring of one year hang around in the following year to help the parents raise the young. Parents will tolerate it as long as the young look like young, but when they are mature, fully mature, they lose the spots on their tail and their bill turns black. And so what Hardy did was capture one of these partly mature birds that was helping the parent feed its young one. As you see, the young ones, when they first come out of the nest, are white. And then the first year bird is down below that one. So Hardy captured one of those first year birds and painted its bill black, and the parent rejected it. So that's very interesting, a study of behavior. So he wanted to show all four stages: the adult, the feeding, the nestling, the juvenile, and then the two stages of growth as the birds change their bill color and their tail spots. This was published in the Wilson Bulletin in 1976. And I should say that the Wilson Bulletin always has a color plate, a color frontispiece, because of Dr. George Sutton. He provided an endowment for Wilson Bulletin to publish color plates in every issue. And I'm so grateful to him for that. Because most scientific illustrations are not in color. This is the only color illustration I did the whole 8 years I was there. Most things, as you saw, snails and bones, don't need, and a lot of the internal anatomy too, don't need the color. Birds, on the other hand, are an exception. Their plumages are so bright. But most scientific illustrations are done in black and white because it's less expensive to reproduce. In fact, it doesn't take any more to reproduce a black and white one than it does to produce type on paper. Now the wash drawings I did, they do require a halftone, so they are a little more expensive. But on the whole, scientific journals do not welcome color because of the high expense. So here is a pen and ink illustration of one of Hardy's students discovered the first hybrid between two species of hummingbirds in California, and he published this with a group of other ornithologists. And that's one pen that I use. I think it's a Hunt 104 pen that enabled me to get very quick strokes, even strokes. And with that one pen, I was able to show the difference between the fluffy softness of the breast feathers versus the rather hard-looking and shiny feathers of the gorget and the top of the head. Let's see. So yeah, this is where I began to teach. A woman named Marion Sheehan was teaching courses in botanical illustration at the university. A fellow, I forgot his name, I'm sorry, was teaching entomological illustration in the entomology for that department, and in the insect illustration. So I got the idea of offering a class in animal drawing for graduate students to record their observations. I approached the head of the zoology department, Dr. Thomas Emmel, right across the plaza from the museum, and he agreed. So the facilities, I must say, were excellent. I had skeletons at the Florida State Museum. I had dead rats for external anatomy at the zoology department, and I had chickens and horses and cattle on the farms because OU was a grant agriculture land grant college. And there was some talk of starting a school of scientific illustration there because there were so many of us teaching, but it really didn't come to be. It was before our time. And then on top of that, the curators in the museum didn't hire me to do this. They hired me to do illustrations for them. So it became difficult, especially since I only had a bachelor's degree, and they didn't like someone with a bachelor's degree teaching in the same department, but they were teaching with a PhD. So it was getting to be obvious that I couldn't continue this. And then we got a new director, and I began to be moved into smaller offices. And one sees the printing, the writing on the wall, and it's time to go. So I left there in 1981, but I stayed on in Gainesville for a while. My first freelance job was really first one of the curators back at the museum. Dr. Walter Offenberg had done work with monitor lizards in the Philippines, and he was asked by the Audubon Society, a group under the Audubon Society called Rare Animal Relief Effort, to produce a poster printed in Indonesian to be sent to that country to tell people, do not hunt this particular lizard. This is a Varanus grayi, Gray's monitor, which was being brought to extinction by overhunting, because this thing is 4 feet long, and with something that size makes a really good dinner for a family, and they were being extirpated. So the poster was saying in Indonesian, other monitors, but not this one. and Offenburg had a specimen. So I did the poster in about half size of the animal, 24. It's 24 by 18. Uh, and Offenburg, as I said, he had the specimen, and he gave me some photographs also of the vegetation. So I was able to do that in watercolor. And the rare animal relief effort included on the cover of their 1981 annual report. As I say, I stayed on and did a whole series of microscopic algae for the Florida Cooperative Extension Service, and a set of flying birds and oil paint for exhibit at the Paynes Prairie Natural Area, and many other things. But I was still looking for a job, and once again, I answered an ad for a summer job for a camp naturalist at Camp Widgiewaga near the Boundary Waters Canoe area in northern Minnesota. Now, I had gone on a canoe trip there years ago and just fell in love with the area, and I couldn't resist applying for this. So I got it. I drove all the way up from Florida for a really wonderful summer. I truly enjoyed it, and was looking forward to coming back to OU to Florida State Museum, to Gainesville, to the university for a grant. I don't remember what it was now, but it was a grant to do a whole series of illustrations for something. I forgot what it was now. And when I came all the way back there, and found out the grant did not come through. And at that point, I just kind of gave up. I can't stay here anymore. So I just packed up everything and went back to Chicago, which is my hometown. In the meantime, my family had moved back here. Um, so I met a professor of environmental studies back here in Chicago at Northeastern Illinois University, who was willing to be my major professor for a master's degree in environmental studies. And environmental studies had no mathematical requirements of a very few, but not that many. And so I felt free to apply and see what I could do with that. At last, a chance to get that master's degree. Um, uh, I took out a student loan. My mother kindly provided room and board, and I wrote my thesis on the documentary artwork of William D. Barry. Now, this ties directly back to OU, because in the 1960s, I had met Dr. William Pruitt, who had come down to visit OU. He showed me some caribou behavior sketches that William D. Barry had done for him. And they were so astounding that I determined to meet Barry. I've got to meet this man. And in 1970, I had that chance. I signed up for a Wilderness Society trip to McKinley National Park, now Denali National Park. And I wrote to Barry in advance, and he not only agreed to meet me, but he actually put me up in his home for several days before the trip started. He showed me into his studio and opened up one of his filing cabinets, and there were a lot of them in there, and showing me all the drawings he had done of every mammal in Alaska, the behavior, the appearance, the color studies. I was just done. I was just uh, breathless. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. And I remember going to his wife and say, Liz, if anything ever happens to Bill, I hope it doesn't. All these drawings, they've got to be saved. They've got to be saved somehow. And she kind of looked at me with it as though she didn't really understand how valuable they were. Of course, they're, you live with these things and you don't realize what you've got. And unfortunately, Bill did die very tragically in 1979. And Liz did donate the whole lot to the University of Alaska. So my thesis, I thought, since I had seen Bill's work, some of it anyway, I was determined to show, first of all, to try to get Bill's work out there, because they were stuck there at the University of Alaska in the archives. No one was seeing them. So I wanted to get them out to the world. But more than that, I wanted to show the world that 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 documentary studies done by a professional artist of animal behavior can be just as scientifically important as work done by a wildlife biologist quantitatively, mathematically, counting the number of times a bird dips into a bird bath versus drawing it. It's valuable. It has value. So I took out a loan and flew up to Alaska and spent 2 months up there going through the entire collection. I was so astonished and amazed at what I saw. I couldn't stop talking to everybody about it. And I came back and wrote my thesis. It was accepted, and I got my degree in 1988. Um, One of the participants in my master's defense hearing was the director of a nature center, part of the Cook County Forest Preserve District. He offered me a job as a naturalist at naturalist. Although my title was naturalist, I was actually hired to do illustrations for the entire Forest Preserve District and for all the 5 nature centers in the county. Now, nature centers often display many wild animals that have been injured and cannot be released. So I did a lot of signage. And of course, in a nature center, compared to a large museum, there's very little money available in nature center. Everything is hands-on, very much hands-on. So this was, I did this in, that's my hand lettering there. And I painted these in acrylic because it could stand up to the exposure. So signage, and then of course, nature centers also usually have a lot of aquaria with turtles and various fish in a tank. And of course, when there's typically one species, more than one species in a tank, you need to have a sign to explain that. We also had a machine, I don't remember the name of it anymore, that printed out letters. So I could do the drawing and then print out all these letters and lay them all out and then tape the drawing to that layout and then make a Xerox copy of it. And that took away all the lines that were created by all the shadow lines from the laying out and all the tape, everything. It was all disappeared. And what I could do, which I did in some cases, once this kind of sign could be put on, glued to a board, then I could hand paint the illustration because it wouldn't buckle because it was stuck onto the board. And I did a whole number of exhibits that way in these separate little panels, one on deer overpopulation in the county, another one on Lyme disease. And I did them all on separate little panels and then sent the panels to each nature center so they could put them up in whichever way they could, or display them on some big board or a wall or wherever they could put them. And let's see. This is I actually, my office was actually River Trail Nature Center, and I redid the brochure for River Trail. This is a scratchboard drawing of the view down at the river. We were right along the Displaced River. And I redid the map, also the inside map, which really needed doing. The old one was really bad. And I also redid some other maps for some of the other nature centers as well, too. And then I think the next one is the beetle. And then of course, we had, you probably know about the Asian longhorn beetle that came in and started on the East Coast and spread gradually west. We've lost a lot of our ash trees. My ash tree out here is holding out pretty well, but we've lost an awful lot of ash trees in this county, the whole blocks of the bedtimes. So this poster I designed, I wrote the thing, I designed it, I laid out all the type, I did all the illustrations, taped it all together, and sent it to the printer. That's all the printer had to do was just print it. So this, and all he had to do was put down below, he had to put all the commissioners' names and of course the Forest Preserve logo down there. Let's see. Although I had considerable freedom in designing and executing posters and exhibits and so forth, um, I miss very keenly the museum atmosphere of working directly with scientists on the leading edge of their research. So when I got an offer from Dr. Roland Kayes, then at the New York State Museum, to illustrate a new field guide to mammals, I jumped on it. Now I jumped ahead of myself here. Back at the Forest Preserve, one of the wildlife biologists was he's still there, by the way. Chris Anker was producing a booklet on uh, endangered species of Cook County. So I did a series of illustrations for him for that. This is our little Massasauga rattlesnake. And then I also did the Indiana bat, and then otters and a variety of other animals. Otters not so much endangered anymore. They've been brought back here to Illinois, and they are getting very popular. Very coming back to our rivers. So now, not onward to Roland Kayes. So I jumped on that chance to illustrate the field guide to mammals. I did he asked me to do the chipmunks and the shrews, all the insectivore shrews and moles. So I asked for and got a year leave of absence from my job at the nature center, and went down to the field museum every day because they had the specimens down there. Um, if they didn't have them, then Dr. Case made sure that they were sent because museums regularly loan specimens back and forth. Um, that was 2001. The book was published the first edition was published in 2002. But the second edition, I did additional watercolor plates of several new species of shrews, and that came out in 2009. So I went back then to the Nature Center for another year, but I retired. By then I was well into my 60s, well past 65, in fact. So I decided to retire in 2000. Now, one of my illustrator colleagues, actually, she worked at the Field Museum in geology department. She was did a lot of paleontological art. Marlene Donnelly. Um, she also teaches at the Chicago Botanic Garden, and she recommended me as a teacher of watercolor, particularly the so-called English style technique, which involves many glazes and dry brush. And I was accepted, and I've been teaching there really since I left the Nature Center, and since 2005. And that those two are examples of that layering technique, with the other was step by step, and this one again doing the green first, and then layering the magenta on top, because it's only by layering one color over another can you get that beautiful effect of see-through, a kind of shimmering effect of color laying over one another. It's only watercolor. Well, sometimes oil glazes you can do that with too, but it's only by glazing over can you really get this wonderful duotone, dual color effect. So I finished my one class in English in beginning watercolor. I'm going to start my English watercolor next week. And I'm very grateful for this opportunity to stay in contact with my profession, and I love my students. I'm so inspired by them. Now, I talked a lot about that I did freelance work, and I didn't show much of it, but really, I've spent about half my life doing freelance work. So I'll try to get through a few things I did before it gets too much later here. Um, I did, for instance, 6 stamps for the National Wildlife Federation from 82 to 84. I did some signage for Lincoln Park in Chicago for the restoration of their pond. And this early horse, not an eelhippus, but a three-toed horse for the Lincoln Park Zoo. I did a habitat drawings for the flora and vegetational history of Winnebago County. And then a number of birds for the Atlas of Breeding Birds in Pennsylvania, and then and this one for the sign for the Morton Grove Prairie in Illinois State Nature Preserve, not far from me at all. And I did also, well, first of all, let me explain that Scott Forsman is or was, they're no longer there, was a publisher of textbooks for grade school, and I was asked to do the illustrations for the ecology chapter in a book called Discover Science. So that's one of the paintings that I did for that. I also did some habitat drawings for the Natural Areas Journal. It's a scratchboard drawing. Did a lot of habitat drawings in pen and ink. And and I illustrated, as I mentioned, a number of new species. The snails and the fish and whatnot. But I think my most exciting new species that I illustrated was this. This is Dr. Roland Kays again, who asked me to do the work for his mammal guide. Was doing a lot of work in Central America and the Northern Andes on olingos. Now they look like lemurs, but they're not. They're relatives of the green-tailed cat and the raccoon family. And a new species was discovered, and he asked me to do the illustration for it. Not only it, but the other three species that closely resemble it. So the new species is on top, and you can see the others were low. He sent me a number of night photographs. These are all nocturnal mammals. He took a number of night photographs, and I was able to piece together these drawings from them. I had the skins also down at the museum. That that was published in Zoo Keys, 2013, a special edition of that. Okay, so a few things about freelancing. I want to talk about a word to the wise. Do not expect to support yourself on freelance work, especially if you have a family. Some of it pays well, most does not. I spent my life going from a salary job to freelance, living on savings, and then got another job, and then back to freelance again until I ran out of money. That's not the way to live, folks. You need much better business sense than I do to be a full-time freelancer. You have to be realistic in figuring time you put in supplies, travel, healthcare versus your income from the job. This is not for the faint-hearted or foolish. I plan on doing freelancing full-time. Also, I want to say briefly some considerations of museum exhibits workers versus scientific illustration. In museum exhibit work, and probably also for zoos, one has to realize that in time, all the artwork will be destroyed and discarded. As science advances and these discoveries are made, exhibit halls are repurposed to keep abreast of the latest research. And of course, in zoos, animals die, they are transferred. So they always need new, and out goes. It just goes. So, but take heart. Even though your artwork may eventually be destroyed, it has served its educational purpose by being viewed by potentially thousands of visitors. Now, remember too, you're also working with a team with exhibits work, and you have to keep up with them, wherever they are in their work to get this exhibit up. You have to keep. So your timing is very, very intense with this. Now, scientific illustration, on the other hand, you're working alone. You're not working with a team. And your work is usually only seen by a few scientists working in that discipline. But remember, too, that your work is preserved indefinitely. If not the actual physical artwork, it's preserved in the scientific literature for you. So on the other hand, there are problems there too, because these curators you're working for are academicians, and they're very competitive. So each will demand your time and may resent if you give too much time to another curator. So there are problems with all of these. Now, of course, everything today is done on a computer. I cannot compete in this environment, so I make no attempt to advance myself into freelance work, none of that. But of course, one doesn't stop being an artist. So I continue to make drawings and paintings whenever I can. Took a great trip to New Zealand about 8 years or so, 7, 8 years ago, bird watching trip. And I felt really sad about the destruction, the entire destruction of all the moas by the Polynesians. And I just wanted to bring one back to life as best I could. So I did a pastel painting of this photograph I took in the high mountains in the South Island, and I painted this moa in there. This is not the big moa. The big moa was 15 feet tall. This is the smallest moa. It comes up to about your hip. Its hip and your hip would be about the same height. It's like the size of a very, very large turkey, maybe. And it's the last moa to become extinct. It was lived up in the high mountains, and this is the habitat where it would have been. I didn't have a scientist to work with, but I did have a friend who had just done a reconstruction of the dodo. So he was very helpful in offering some advice. So that's pretty much where I am. And now I'm interested to hear from you and what your plans are for your life. I want to hear your questions.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That was fantastic. Um, really enjoyed hearing the arc of your career and your life, which are, one and the same in many ways. So I'm going to open up the chat. Well, both we have chat and Q&A for questions, but would also welcome, I don't know, Haley, you and your group, if you want to jump in with anything while we wait for questions, that would be more than welcome as well.
Had to unmute. There we go. I had a question I was thinking about as we were looking at your broad array of drawings is how much freedom were you given to determine the style and media that you used for each different work throughout everything? Like how much freedom were you allowed with that? Because some of the work was like very detailed. Some of it, like the one you just showed, seemed a little bit more gestural or slightly less detailed. So I'm just curious what helped you decide that, and yeah.
Well, as a scientific illustrator, one is limited, as I said, by by the the reproduction. And as I say, these scientific journals are are produced by and for members of a particular organization, like the Society of Vertebrate Paleontologists, for instance. They produce a journal, and the money for that journal comes from the dues of the members. And how many are there there aren't that many. They don't have a lot of money. So as a result, they prefer to have the cheapest possible reproduction, and that is pen and ink. So the bones, as I say, they could have been done in stipple. It takes a lot longer in stipple, and also the bones just have a linear quality. Some of them do, at least the long limb bones certainly do, and you can just almost see the linear quality as you look at the bone. So and say when David Webb showed me that those illustrations were probably done in the 1800s of line drawing, I thought, oh gosh, that's beautiful. I can learn that. And so it worked really well for the bones. For the snails, some of them I did in stipple, in pen and ink stipple. It takes a longer time. You can't quite show the shininess and the kind of translucence in snails that you can with watercolor wash. Although it does cost a little more. You have to have a special screen to be able to show it. So it was pretty much determined by the needs of the publication. And also, when you look at these publications, usually on the back page, there's a description of what is required for for publication. It has to be so many words, not go over that number of words. Uh, and then the illustrations is explained the page size, the page portions, and they may even suggest the typeface. They usually don't, but so the specifications for illustrations are usually included in the instructions on the very back page of the journal.
Thank you, Nancy. We do have a question from in the Q&A from Allison Stump. Allison asks, is a science degree needed to work in scientific illustration?
That's a wonderful question, isn't it? In the Guild of Natural Science Illustrators, I would say about half of the students are came from an art background. I think these students, half of the members came from an art background, and the other half came from a science background. So it helps to have both. The science certainly helps, and you learn a lot of science, whether you want to learn or not. You certainly learn a great deal. Yes, I found my science extremely helpful. I had 4 years of Latin in high school, and I found that so helpful. You would think that Latin would be something so removed, but I held on to it, and I use it. I still use it. It's just been some very, very useful. So whatever you can get to help you is useful. Other languages and anything in science and art, there's so much to learn. It's kind of overwhelming. I'm still trying to learn everything I can about color theory, and oh goodness, there's just an enormous amount, but it all helps. It all helps.
Other questions from?
I have a quick question. When you're not working on like a commission or something that somebody has requested on your free time, what do you like to draw or sketch?
Oh, well, during COVID, I couldn't really go anywhere. What I like to do is go to zoos. We have 2 wonderful zoos here in the Chicago area.
Yeah.
I like to go to zoos and sketch. In fact, when I was working on this MOA, I remember I went down to the Brookfield Zoo and did some drawings of some of the larger birds. I think it was a cassowary, the cassowary, and the rheas. Yeah, so I really enjoy that. I enjoy sketching from life. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, that sketching from life, it can't be beat. I have to say, and that's what got me so interested in teaching down at the University of Florida, because you just can't get the animal movement and feel from a photograph, a still photograph. You really need to see the animal in real life and see the muscles ripple and see the joints move, especially with birds. What they when they fluff up their feathers, they do it by feather group, and you can see how the feathers are arranged. And it's when the bird finishes fluffing, it'll lay them all down, and you can just see how they all fit neatly into place. So you just need to see a real bird, watch it do that before you can really understand how it's put together.
I was wondering about that. It is so common to work from a photograph because it's static. And like, I was wondering about your take on that. If you work both sometimes, or and what do you think about working from photographs?
I've had to. There are times, I mean, I never saw live lingo, for instance. So I had to work from case photographs.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, but But if you have a knowledge of how these animals move, for instance, I did a portrait once of a ringtail cat from a live animal, and that helped me a lot when I was looking at the Alingos and trying to draw them.
Mm-hmm.
So
I love the Brooksville Zoo. I used to go there too. Is it still free to the public?
no,
No,
no.
they used.
Lincoln Park Zoo
Oh,
is still,
Lincoln Park. Yeah.
yeah,
Oh,
that's
okay.
still free.
Yeah.
Brookfield
Yeah.
Zoo is very expensive.
It's always
They,
been. Yeah.
they not only charge for admission, but they charge for parking really high.
Yeah. I was getting those two messed up. Yeah.
Yeah.
I always went to the free one.
Yeah. Lincoln Park Zoo also has a beautiful plant conservatory there too. And that's a really enjoyable place to go to. Yeah. Right by the lake, right on the lake there. It's very nice.
Thank you, Nancy.
Sure.
We have another kind of two questions from Elvira McDade. So the first kind of paired set of questions is there a growing network of artist residencies and programs for scientific illustration? And if you know of those, do you have recommendations for seniors that are graduating this spring? So maybe we can start with that, and then we'll ask the second one after you've had a chance to mull that over.
Now there's where the guild comes in. Because I've kind of lost. I really don't have any more connection really with a wide um, uh, other universities and other places that are offering. The guild has a big collection of who's offering what, where, when. And I know the University of California has a big program. You'd have to ask the guild for more information, but they do have a graduate program there too. And their school is very, very active. So do contact the guild because they at one time the guild actually published a booklet on the various courses offered across the country. So the guild will give you the best answer for that.
Okay, that kind of answers the second question, which was what graduate programs exist for scientific illustration. So
firsthand, I would think of the one in California. And I forget which university that was, but I remember it being Monterey Bay. Is it Monterey Bay? Yeah, I can't. I don't know California that well, but that's the one that comes to my mind. And of course, a lot of illustrators came from or may have gone off to medical illustration because at first we actually met with for our annual meetings. We actually met with the AMI people, American Medical Illustration Association, for the first couple of years. Then we went entirely on our own. But there were a number of people who were both medical illustrators and scientific illustrators. I'm thinking of Trudy Nicholson in particular, was a marvelous scratchboard artist, but she is also a medical illustrator. She worked for Johns Hopkins, I believe. Yeah, I think.
Can I ask a follow-up question about that? Actually, would you say, in terms of students who are training right now to be illustrators, if they're being trained primarily in sort of natural science illustration, are those transferable pretty smoothly to like medical illustration, or are there specific techniques to each of those areas, technically or aesthetically, that you have noticed?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure I can fully answer. You really need to talk to someone who is both a medical or has been a medical and a scientific, or has been a scientific and is now a medical illustrator. Because I know people who do both very, very well. I mentioned Trudy, and there's several others too I can think of. Yeah, it's you really what I suggest is that if you can come to Bridgewater next June, I don't have the dates. I don't remember the dates. I think it were July, and you could meet some of these people and talk to them about their work and what they do, because it's so exciting to attend a JNSI conference because you're just bowled over by the kind of work that people do. There are people are so much better doing certain things that I could never do. especially on a computer these days. I was just overwhelmed at the last Zoom meeting I just attended last month. Just overwhelmed at the things that illustrators are doing with computers. There's a great need, especially now with COVID, for a lot of microbiology illustrations, and those are all done on the computer. So I'm just amazed at what so many really good illustrators in the guild can do and have done.
Other questions from folks? Nancy, when was the last time you were back in Norman?
I went back when the museum opened. That was the only time I've gone back because I remember being there with Dr. Sutton, and the museum at that time was in Army barracks. Did you hear about an awful Army barracks that were not really properly air conditioned, and they really I don't know how the specimens made it through that. Really, and I remember they were fire traps. They were literally fire traps. And I remember one time because all the chemicals were in there too, for the specimens. And one time a fire actually started, and Sutton was in there, and he went in. He rushed in there to try to save the specimens, and he got some very serious lung damage for a while there. He recuperated, but it was really really scary. So when I heard that the new museum was being built and open, especially since so many of folks from Michigan State went down there to go there, and from Michigan State Museum itself went down to OU. I just had to go down. I just had to go down and open. In fact, I demanded. I remember that Sutton's work was I think being put on exhibit, but it wasn't open yet. But I said, I am Sutton's student and I demand to have, I really did. I said, I want to see. So I got the curator, I forgot who that was now, gave me a personal tour in there. I said, I want to see. So I was so excited to see this new museum open. Yeah, I haven't been back since though.
I wish
I've
you
only been
could.
back to Florida once too. So yeah.
Um, we do have another question in the Q&A, again from Elvira McDade, who
Yeah.
says, do you have a routine that you follow that's guided your artistic process? And when do you find yourself being in a state of flow?
Oh my. Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. A routine. I get most of my inspiration by traveling. Uh, for instance, I've gone to Wisconsin recently over the years for various workshops, and I'm just so inspired by the scenery up there and by the instructor that I've come back with some very nice paintings that I did later. Sometimes I would take a photograph and then make that into a painting from my memory. And after I make sketches, take a photograph, and then put those two together in a painting back at home. But traveling, that's how I did the Lumoa illustration. That's not a very big painting. It's a small painting. It's, I don't know, 9 by 12, something like that. But that's where I get most of my inspiration is travel.
I think we have another question from Kayla Hawkins, who asks, with freelance work, do you seek out opportunities or do they usually approach you? And then how did you kind of put yourself out there?
Well, I am not a good advertiser, to tell you the truth. I really was. I remember that when I started freelancing, when I left my job at the Florida State Museum, that's probably when I put out most of the effort. Because I actually drove up to Washington, D.C. I drove up to New York City, or went to New York City to see publishers. I really made an effort to try to get myself known. I made a brochure, which I think I may have sent one to you. so I did get that's how I got the stamps for the National Wildlife Federation. I've been a member of National Wildlife Federation for years and years. It's a wonderful organization. And Roger Tory Peterson was the art director of the stamp program. And that stamp program went on for years and years and years. And when he died, it stopped. Too bad. They didn't have anyone to take it over. But I was asked to do several stamps for them. And some of them were printed elsewhere in larger format later. Also, they invited me when they had an exhibit of, what do they call? To remember the name of the title of the exhibit in, I can't remember what year, 1983, I think it was. They had an exhibit on wildlife art, and they invited me to come up, and I won second prize in watercolor for an illustration of a water rat that I had done down in Florida. So they've really been wonderful to me. I really have enjoyed my association with the National Wildlife Federation. But I'm sorry to say that the stamp program ended. Most of my freelance illustrations, most of my freelance contacts have been just temporary. And sometimes they just ended and nothing more came of it. But you have to be very aggressive, and I'm not an aggressive person, and I don't have a whole lot of good business sense, I think, as I mentioned earlier. So it's you really have to be highly organized and very I don't want to use the word aggressive, but you have to get out there and show what you can do. Find the right people and just show them. And I don't have that kind of aggressive impulse to do that kind of. But I
Nancy,
was, yeah.
I was going to ask you if you, when you started out doing freelance, and this might be more applicable for really quite junior people, but did you start by doing free work just so that you could sort of build your portfolio and build the contacts? Or
Yeah. The mice I did for Carly were yeah, I just did them phrase. It's just part of being a student down there, I figured. Sort of like homework, you know. Yeah, those I didn't charge for that. And maybe for the first few down there too, I didn't, but I did. I was actually hired by the Oklahoma Geological Survey after I graduated to do all those many illustrations of invertebrates for Dr. Carl Granson down there. So yeah, then of course I needed to. By then I was completely independent, and I needed the income.
well, I think we're almost at time, and that was a great kind of discussion. I just want to say thank you so much, Nancy, for joining us and sharing your time and experiences with us. Like I said, we'll be back in touch with folks about where the recording of the presentation will be in case you want to revisit anything. Yeah, just thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming. And yeah, we'll be in touch.
Okay, well, thank you all and for listening, and I hope my comments were helpful.
Very
I
much
think so.
so.
Yeah,
Right.
really great.
Okay, thanks.
All right, everyone have a wonderful day.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Bye,
Thank you.
Nancy.
Bye. Good luck to you, students.
Bye.
Bye.